Waking up before dawn, your sandals worn thin from months of walking unpaved roads across Galilee. You have no savings, no permanent home, and no guarantee of your next meal. You left your fishing nets, your tax booth, your family, everything, to follow a wandering teacher from Nazareth who speaks about a kingdom no one can fully explain. This is not a myth. This is not a legend. This is what real people experienced in real time in one of the most documented and consequential moments in all of human history. Today, we are going inside that world. What did these men actually see? What did they eat, fear, argue about, and believe? What was it truly like to walk beside Jesus of Nazareth in the year 30 AD? Let's go back. The world in 30 AD was not gentle. The Roman Empire controlled Judea through a combination of military force and political manipulation. Taxes were crushing. The average Jewish peasant in Galilee paid multiple layers of taxation to Rome, to Herod Antipas, and to the temple in Jerusalem. Historians estimate that between 35 and 40% of a family's income could be claimed through various forms of tribute and religious tithes. Poverty was not the exception. It was the norm. Into this world came a teacher who said the poor were blessed, that the meek would inherit the earth. These were not comfortable, abstract ideas. To the people hearing them for the first time, they were explosive. The disciples, those closest to Jesus, were not philosophers or scholars. They were working-class men from the region of Galilee, a northern area of ancient Israel known for its fishing industry, agricultural communities, and a reputation among Jerusalem elites as somewhat rough around the edges. Galileans had a distinctive accent. They were considered provincial by the educated classes of Judea. When Peter was later identified as a follower of Jesus in Jerusalem, it was partly because of how he talked. Most of the 12 apostles listed in the Gospels came from this world. Simon Peter and his brother Andrew were fishermen. So were James and John, the sons of Zebedee. Matthew, also called Levi, was a tax collector, which in that era meant he worked for the Roman system and was considered a social outcast by many of his fellow Jews. Simon the Zealot almost certainly had connections to a politically radical movement that opposed Roman rule. Philip and Bartholomew came from Bethsaida. Thomas, Thaddeus, James the son of Alphaeus, these were ordinary men whose names we know only because of what happened to them. The call to discipleship in the Jewish tradition was not unusual in itself. Rabbis gathered students, called Talmudim, who would follow them closely, memorize their teachings, and eventually go out and teach others. But there was something profoundly different about how Jesus called his disciples. Normally, a student chose a rabbi. Here, the rabbi was choosing the students, and he was choosing men who, by conventional standards, had already not made the cut for formal religious education. This detail, small as it seems, would have been striking to anyone in that culture who understood it. So what was a typical day like? There was no typical day, and that itself was part of the challenge. The disciples traveled constantly. Jesus and his followers moved through the villages and towns of Galilee, from Capernaum on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee to the surrounding hillsides, to the Decapolis on the eastern bank, and eventually southward toward Jerusalem. This was not casual sightseeing. On foot, the distance from Capernaum to Jerusalem was roughly 120 miles. In the terrain of first-century Judea, that journey could take 6 or more days. They traveled in a group, which included not just the 12 apostles, but also a wider circle of followers, including, notably, a number of women. Luke's Gospel specifically names several women, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Susanna, and states that they provided financial support for the group out of their own resources. This was socially unconventional for the time and culturally significant. These women were not passive observers. They were active participants in the movement. Shelter was wherever they could find it. Sometimes homes of supporters. Peter had a house in Capernaum where Jesus stayed and healed Peter's mother-in-law. Sometimes they slept outdoors. The Gospels record moments where Jesus himself had nowhere to lay his head, a statement that implies the group often lacked secure lodging. Food was similarly uncertain. The feeding of the 5,000, one of the most famous events in the Gospels, is set up precisely because the crowd had been in a remote place for an extended time and had nothing to eat. Provisions were a constant concern. What did they eat when provisions were available? The diet of a first-century Galilean was simple and calorie-efficient. Bread made from wheat or barley was the staple. Olives and olive oil were central, both as food and as fuel for lamps. Dried or fresh fish from the Sea of Galilee was common, particularly for this group given their backgrounds. Lentils, figs, dates, grapes, and seasonal vegetables filled out the diet. Wine, heavily diluted with water, was the standard beverage because clean drinking water was not always reliably available. If you were a disciple, you were eating this food on the road after long days of walking, surrounded by crowds of people who wanted healing, answers, or simply a glimpse of the teacher everyone was talking about. And the crowds were real. Multiple independent historical sources, not just the Gospels, confirm that Jesus of Nazareth was a figure who attracted significant public attention during his ministry. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the late 1st century, refers to Jesus as a wise man who drew large followings. The social phenomenon was real enough that it made the religious and political authorities in Jerusalem deeply nervous. For the disciples, this popularity was both thrilling and disorienting. People brought the sick to Jesus in such numbers that the Gospels describe situations where he could not enter a town openly. A woman touched the edge of his garment in a crowd and felt something happen. A paralyzed man was lowered through a roof because the room was too full to enter any other way. The disciples were in the middle of all of this, managing crowds, keeping people back, trying to understand what they were witnessing. They argued, this is one of the most humanizing details in the gospel accounts. The disciples argued about who was the greatest among them. James and John asked for the best seats in the coming kingdom, which infuriated the others. Peter rebuked Jesus for speaking about suffering and death. Thomas demanded evidence. They fell asleep when they were asked to stay awake and pray. They panicked during a storm on the lake while Jesus slept in the boat. These were not perfect men performing perfect faith. They were confused, ambitious, frightened, loyal, and struggling. Exactly what you might expect from human beings suddenly caught inside something much larger than themselves. And here is what you have to understand about their psychological experience. They had no New Testament. They had no church history. They had no hindsight. Every day they were interpreting events in real time with the tools of their own Jewish tradition, the Torah, the prophets, the Psalms, trying to understand what it meant that this particular man did what he did and said what he said. Their framework was messianic expectation, but the Messiah most Jews anticipated was a political and military deliverer who would restore the kingdom of David. What they were experiencing did not fit neatly into that framework, and that tension is visible throughout the gospel narratives. By the time they arrived in Jerusalem for the Passover that would become the last week of Jesus' public ministry, the atmosphere was electrically dangerous. Jerusalem during Passover was a city of enormous crowds. Estimates suggest that the population could swell from its normal size to several 100,000 pilgrims. Roman soldiers were stationed on the rooftops of the Temple Mount specifically to monitor the crowds and prevent uprising. Pilate, the Roman prefect, came up from Caesarea Maritima specifically for the holiday to manage the security situation personally. For the disciples, entering the city with Jesus after the public entry on a donkey that drew cheering crowds, After the dramatic confrontation in the temple, after days of public teaching that increasingly antagonized the religious leadership, must have felt both exhilarating and terrifying. They did not know what was coming. Or rather, Jesus had told them, but they had not fully understood or accepted it. When the arrest happened in the Garden of Gethsemane, the disciples scattered. This is one of the most historically credible details in the entire Passion narrative, precisely because it is so unflattering to the people who would eventually go on to lead the early church. You would not invent this story about your founding figures. They ran. Peter, who had sworn he would never abandon Jesus, denied knowing him 3 times before dawn. And yet, and this is where the history becomes genuinely remarkable, within weeks of the crucifixion, these same frightened, scattered men were back in Jerusalem, publicly proclaiming that Jesus had risen from the dead, and doing so in the very city where the execution had taken place. They were not doing this from a safe distance. They were doing it in front of the same authorities who had just had their teacher killed. Whatever you believe about what happened in that tomb, the behavior of the disciples afterward is one of the most documented and analyzed puzzles in the study of ancient history. Something transformed them. Something changed frightened men into people willing to face imprisonment, beatings, and eventually death for their testimony. Most of the original disciples, according to both early Christian tradition and what we can reconstruct historically, died violently. James, the son of Zebedee, was executed by Herod Agrippa around 44 AD, the earliest recorded martyrdom of an apostle, mentioned in the book of Acts and therefore one of the earliest Christian documents. Peter, according to tradition preserved by multiple early sources, was crucified in Rome. The same Nero-era persecution that took Peter's life likely took Paul's as well, though Paul was a later addition to the circle rather than one of the original 12. These were not men who died for something they knew to be a comfortable legend. Whatever their experience had been in those 3 years on the road in Galilee, it was real enough to them that they carried it all the way to the end. If this kind of deep historical storytelling resonates with you, if you find yourself genuinely curious about the real world behind history's most important moments, then hit the like button right now and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps more people find this content. And drop a comment below. If you could ask one of the original disciples a single question, what would it be? The answers in this community are always fascinating. What was it like to be a disciple of Jesus in 30 AD? It was exhausting, uncertain, sometimes terrifying, and apparently, for those who lived it, absolutely unforgettable. They gave up everything for it. And they never went back.